Do you have a Bristan Easyfit kitchen tap in your home? Do you have any friends who might have? I'm Hamish Erskine, I'm a plumber in Exeter, and I fitted 21 Bristan Easyfit kitchen taps for my customers between June 2015 and June 2016. In July and August of this year, 3 of those blew off, just like the one that I've demonstrated. Unfortunately for those 3 customers, they weren't expecting it in the way that I was. And had they been out at the time, it would have resulted in a major flood and a big insurance claim. Fortunately, they were home at the time and they were able to turn off the mains, and they had mopping up to do, but the damage wasn't massive. Bristan, the UK's largest tap manufacturer, introduced these taps in 2014. By now there must be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Bristan Easyfit taps in kitchens around Britain. And their homeowners have no idea that their houses are at risk of flooding because of these taps. These taps are held onto the base by 2 small grub screws that you tighten with an Allen key. But over a period of months or years, those work their way loose, and the result is what you just saw. This video is part 3 in a series entitled Problems with Bristan Easyfit Kitchen Taps. Part 1 was primarily to warn my own 21 Easyfit customers. In part 2, with the help of Bertie, I explored the reasons for the flaw in Bristan's design. Today's video is primarily for Bristan. I'm going to call upon Bertie once again, and this time, having shown them what's wrong with their design, Bertie's going to suggest a possible redesign that might actually work. Obviously, I'm just a plumber. Coming up with a new design is an engineer's job. So without further ado, it's over to Bertie. He's the one with a degree in mechanical engineering, but he'll probably introduce himself in his Bertie kind of way. Thank you, Hamish. Hello, the name's Erskine, Albert Erskine. Before we look at a possible redesign of these taps, I want to first convince you, Hamish, that the Easyfit idea is worth saving. Watching your first video, you asked at one point, how is that an Easyfit tap? The scepticism in your voice was unmistakable. Given that the Easyfit design adds an extra interface between the base and the tap, and that this interface has been so problematic, would it just be better for Bristan to abandon the whole Easyfit idea and go back to the old system, where the pipe tails attach directly to the tap? There are going to be a lot of plumbers like you and Plumber Croft who, after the problems you've had with these taps, will say, that's the last Easyfit tap we will fit. Hamish, you fix so many toilets that you're well known here in Exeter as the toilet doctor, which, by the way, doesn't mean that you're smarter than an engineer. You don't need a PhD to be a toilet doctor. Anyway, let me use toilet parts to convince you of the value of the Easyfit idea. I found these 2 siphons in your van, Hamish. This is the basic model, which is a one-piece design. By the way, Hamish, these don't work by magic, but by basic scientific principles. And here I have your favourite, the Dudley Turbo Siphon, which I've heard you call your Nimbus 2000 racing siphon. This is a 2-piece design with an additional interface and a yellow button. If you press the yellow button and remove that, the top detaches from the base, and it's just the same idea that as the Easyfit design that Bristan have used in their taps. When you initially install one of these, the process is exactly the same as with the basic design. You have to remove the toilet cistern in order to fit this through the hole in the bottom of the cistern, and then attach the back nut from underneath. But several years later, when this stops working because the thin plastic diaphragm gets a split in it, then there's a big difference. With this one, you have to remove the cistern all over again to undo that back nut, to lift this out and to change the diaphragm. And there you have about a 1 hour job. Whereas with this one, it's very straightforward. All you do is remove the yellow pin, the top half lifts off, and in 10 minutes you can change the diaphragm on this one. Now, don't you agree, Hamish, that this is a really good idea? Well, now you put it like that, Bertie, I can see that there's value in the Easyfit idea, even if it isn't any easier to fit initially. I hadn't thought of it, but he's right. An Easyfit tap is just like a Turbo 88, except that this has never flooded a customer's house. He's right. I do love my Turbo 88. Don't believe the Nimbus 2000 twaddle, but I do love my Turbo 88 racing siphon. Dudley should organise plumber championships with these. See, this is how it works. You press the yellow turbo button, you pull back on the throttle and it's lift off. You then straight into the first bend, straight down the track and screech into the pits. You're off with the wheel hub, off with the tyre, on with the new one. Straight back on with the wheel hub, screech at the pits, straight down the track, into the final bend, heading for the finishing line. And there we go. He's over the line. It's goal for Hamish. It's the performance of his life. Bertie, that's not recording, I do trust. Oh, bother. He's such an idiot. Anyway, I think I've convinced him about the value of the Easyfit idea. Even if it's no easier to fit in the first place, it's great to have a design that is easier to fix down the line. Having a separate tap and base isn't such a bad idea, as long as it's done properly and the tap won't flood the customer's house. Okay, let's get back to redesigning the Easyfit tap and base. First of all, let's look at the changes that Bristan themselves have made to the 2016 models. The tap that we looked at in part 2 was a 2015 model. Comparing the two taps, the only difference I can see is in the serial number. It now ends in 16 instead of in 15. The changes are in the base. Looking at the 2016 model base, I can see that they've fixed two potential flaws that we never even looked at in part 2. Notice how they've removed the wedge that was cut out of the 2015 model base. Also notice that instead of just 2 bevels for the grub screws, now they've got 4 bevels for those grub screws, so it's no longer critical which way round this goes, which is the front and which is the back. On the old base, next to where it has the serial number, it also said front. As you leant over the sink and fitted the tap, when you tightened the grub screws, they would screw into the bevels. If you got this back to front, the grub screws would screw into the flat surface, and I imagine that after turning on mains water pressure, the tap would have blown in a matter of minutes or hours rather than months or years. So with plumbers like Hamish in mind, they've tried to make the new one idiot-proof. Bertie, I know you think I'm an idiot, but I'm not that stupid. I do understand what front means. By making the base a full circle, they've also addressed a second flaw. Notice now how the O-ring underneath the base is now a full circle, preventing the possibility of water dribbling down through the hole in the sink, down the pipe tails and into the sink, into the cupboard below. Now, to understand the seriousness of that flaw, you have to appreciate how long this base needs to last. The tap should last about 10 years. It might start dripping a little bit after, say, 5 years and need a replacement pair of ceramic disc cartridges. But the tap should last about 10 years. Now, the idea of these is that when you eventually replace the tap, you only replace the tap, but you retain the original base. And so if the tap lasts 10 years, the base needs to last 20 years or even more. When the tap is changed after 10 years, say, the plumber might forget to change these rubber O-rings. After 10 years, these rubber O-rings will have hardened up and gone brittle. And so if you, when you remove the tap and fit the new one, these are likely to suffer damage. If you omit to do that and there's a slight damage, you might get a slight dribble that works its way down the flexi tails into the cupboard below. Now, these flexible tails are corrosion resistant. They can cope with normal, say, condensation. But if you've got a dribble running down them for several years, eventually these will rust. And eventually the metal braiding on the outside will lose its strength and the rubber tube inside will balloon and burst under mains water pressure. So that's another reason these taps could flood your house in the long term. So now they've addressed that, or well, almost. Water could in fact still dribble down here, down here. In order to really fix that, they could perhaps put a little O-ring here and another one here, and it would fix that. So the 2016 model base fixes, or nearly fixes, two serious design flaws that we never even touched on last time. Unfortunately, it doesn't address the design flaw that we did look at, which causes the grub screws to work loose over a period of months or years, even on taps that have been installed correctly with the grub screws properly tightened by the installer. The tap is still held on to the base by those same two grub screws that press against a bevel. Mains water pressure exerts a vertical upward force on the tap, and that is resisted by the downward force of the base on the grub screw. Unfortunately, that downward force on the grub screw is merely a component of the actual force of the base on the grub screw. The actual force acts perpendicular to the bevel. Consequently, there is still a horizontal component that they seem to have overlooked, which tries to push the grub screw outwards, giving them a tendency to unwind. And every time you turn the tap off, the pressure increase gives the grub screws a little nudge or jolt, causing them bit by bit over a period of months or years to unwind and loosen. Unfortunately, the 2016 model is still not fit for purpose. Seeing this, I can see why Bristan haven't yet issued a full product recall for the 2014 and 15 models. They'll only do that when they've got a redesign that fixes the flaw. Otherwise, when they do their recall, what are they going to replace the old taps with? Right, let's look at a redesign that might actually work. What you need to hold the tap onto the base is to turn this flange into a union nut. Now, when I say a nut, I don't mean an ugly great hexagonal nut. Circular should be fine for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But you would have to increase the internal diameter of this so that it slips onto the tap body, not in that orientation, but this way round, and slips up here. Here on this radiator valve, I have an example of a union nut. Taking that off, here I have the union nut and the radiator tail. Notice that the union nut can slip down the radiator tail this way, but if I try and pull it that way, I can't pull it off because of this lip. Now ignore the fact that this lip is beveled. I'm just interested in the fact that it stops the union nut from coming off. On the tap, thinking of this as a union nut, I need this union nut to be able to slip down the body of the tap, and then I need a circular lip to stop it from coming off. To add that lip, I would need the inside of this tap to have a thread on it, and I'd need a small circular flange that would screw into that and have a larger diameter at one end, giving me a flat lip at that end. Looking at this as a union nut, I would need a female thread on the inside of this and a corresponding male thread on this surface here on the base. And so after fitting the tap to the base, I would then simply screw this up, and the thread on this would engage with the thread on this, and this would tighten up the tap to the base. If the thread on this is a nice fine thread, you wouldn't need your union nut to be very tight. A thread is a kind of gear. A relatively large clockwise movement of the nut tightens the tap down onto the base by a very small vertical movement. If you have a fine enough thread, the gearing ratio should be high enough that hand tight should pretty much suffice. Or possibly you might want to tighten it an extra fraction of a turn with some pump pliers on this, but being careful not to scuff the chrome. If using this as a union nut, an important long-term consideration is that you must prevent water ingress and corrosion of that thread. In 10 years' time, when you come to change the tap, you want to be able to undo that union nut. I would retain the O-ring at the bottom of this in order to prevent water working its way in from below and up the thread by capillary action. I might also include a thin poly washer between the union nut and the lip around the base of the tap. Let me show you another example of a union nut. So here I have on 40mm waist compression coupling, I have a union nut that joins onto this coupling. Notice that between the union nut and the lip we have a thin poly washer. On the tap, that poly washer would prevent water entering in here just above your union nut and then working its way down onto the thread inside. Additionally, your installation guide could also instruct the installer to wrap a couple of turns of PTFE tape around this thread, and that would further protect it from water ingress and corrosion. Speaking of the installation guide, if Bristan have known about the problem of these Easyfit taps popping since at least January 2015, and a year and 8 months later are still blaming it on installer error, in other words the plumber, one thing they might have considered is the quality of their installation guide. Bristan's guide is bland and printed in small text. A crucial part of the guide must be paragraph 5, how to fit the tap body. Bristan could learn from Saniflo. Saniflo are the experts in how you cut things up into small pieces and get them to pass through a smaller diameter. They do that not only with their toilet macerators, but even with their installation guide. With plumbers like Hamish in mind, they take the most important points and present them as 10 golden rules on a single sheet of A4 with pictures and traffic lights. You see, if you give a new design of tap to a plumber like Hamish, he'll play around with it for a minute, say to himself, "Oh yes, I see how this works," and probably proceed to fit it without reading a poor quality installation guide with small print. But there might actually be something important in that small print that isn't immediately obvious. If you don't believe me, read paragraph 5 carefully, then watch Bristan's official How to Install an Easyfit Kitchen Tap video and ask yourself, did their plumber read the guide? For example, the written instructions tell you how to grease the push-fit connector, that is the nipples here, using the sachet of grease provided in the box. Does he use it? And they tell you how to use the Allen key to achieve the correct tightness on the grub screws. You're supposed to first insert the long end and tighten by turning the short end. Then insert the short end and turn a further 3/4 of a turn using the long end. Does he follow this?
I'm going to show you just how easy it is to fit these taps.
Now, there's still one way that water ingress might corrode this thread and make it difficult to loosen the union nut in 10 years' time. That is, if these rubber O-rings are damaged, water could work its way down from here into the thread. You would then be somewhat snookered. Your plumber might decide to change the whole tap, including the base. But how would he remove the base, given that it is secured from above, and that you can't loosen the base without first removing the tap? Well, Bertie, in that situation, you'd be left with no choice but to get the angle grinder out and just grind right through the body of the tap. But you'd end up with brass dust all over the kitchen and all over your face, and you'd arrive at your next job looking like you'd borrowed your wife's glitter bronzer. Gosh, we don't want Hamish covered in glitter bronzer. In that case, I think it would be best to secure the base to the sink by the old method of using a back nut from underneath instead of the Allen key method from above. It might seem a shame to backtrack on that feature of the Easyfit design, but given that you have to get under the sink anyway to attach the pipe tails to the underside of the base, the old back nut method for securing the base wouldn't make it any less easy to fit. You could still have your separate tap and base, but merely use the old horseshoe and back nut method to secure the base to the sink. It would be a bit like the Turbo 88. They still use the same old back nut method to secure the siphon in the first place. One final design consideration I might raise is about the O-rings on these nipples. If the tap body is replaced in 10 years' time but the base is retained, the installer might omit to change those rubber O-rings. To avoid the likelihood of such an installer error, it might be better to have smooth nipples on the base and to have your O-rings as part of the tap body. For example, think of how this smooth copper pipe fits into this speed fit coupling. If you open this up, you see how the coupling contains a rubber O-ring and a plastic retaining ring. In a similar way, you could have your rubber O-ring embedded into the female side of the tap body. And the little flange which I described earlier that would screw into this tap body to give you a little lip at that end, that same retaining ring or flange could also be designed to hold the O-rings in place, ensuring that when you remove the old tap body, you remove the old rubber O-rings with it to be replaced by the new rubber O-rings in the new tap body. Now you might watch these videos and think that I am critical of Bristan's design team. And certainly I think they have some tough questions to answer. However, their intentions have been perfectly commendable. They have tried to be innovative and come up with an easier and better design of tap. We don't just live in Britain, but in Great Britain. And one of the things that makes British engineering great is a willingness to be innovative. Innovation often means leaving behind the safety of the tried and tested design and trying to come up with something better, even though there's an inherent risk that innovations might go wrong. An innovative design team needs the support of an excellent quality control department. And this is where I see Bristan's biggest shortcomings. An effective quality control system requires a number of things. Firstly, they must keep their eyes and ears open and have a willingness to thoroughly investigate any problems that are reported. Their ears are their customer service personnel who listen to customers' problems and complaints. Their eyes are their engineers whom they send out to investigate reported problems. Secondly, the quality control department must have excellent communication channels, not just between their eyes and ears, but also back to the design team who are the real brains in the system, as well as up the chain to senior management who are the mouthpiece of the company and responsible for making big policy decisions. When quality control exposes serious problems, they must have the ear of the managing director or the CEO to request necessary changes, however painful or costly those might be. What is most astonishing to me is the reluctance Hamish encountered from Bristan's customer services to investigate his problem taps. When he asked them to send out an engineer, they allowed weeks to go by without doing so. It was only after he twisted their arm by publishing his first video that they sent out their first engineer to one of his customers. Back to Hamish. Bertie, I do agree with you there that the real problem lies with Bristan's quality control. I think it might be worth listening to snippets of a conversation I had with Bristan's customer services on the 2nd of August 2016. To set the context for this, it was the day after my third Easyfit tap had popped. The customer's child had been using the tap at the time, when suddenly the kitchen sink turned into a water fountain. What freaked me out most was that the family was due to leave for their summer holiday the very next morning. And I asked myself, what would have happened if that tap had popped one day later? And I had 20 more Easyfit customers out there who might also be just about to go on their summer holidays. Because of the seriousness of the situation, I did have my phone linked to my Bluetooth speaker so that I could record both sides of the conversation. Listening to these clips, please understand that I am not criticising the individual who answered the phone. I was quite worked up, and she handled me extremely professionally. But I do think this conversation gives a valuable snapshot of one small element of Bristan's quality control and how they've been responding to this problem. Let's listen to the beginning of the conversation first.
If you have an account with us, or you are a plumber or a member of the trade, please press 1.
Good morning, Bristan Group. Debbie speaking. How can I help?
Good morning. My name's Hamish. I'm a local plumber in Exeter. I've fitted about, in the last couple of years, I've fitted about 20 of your Easyfit kitchen taps. And yesterday I had for the third time I had a customer call me up with the tap having come detached from the base. Let's jump to the relevant clip. I'm becoming increasingly concerned, actually, and you know, it's my opinion that you need to issue a product recall on your Easyfit range.
I have to say, there's not been that many instances, but when we've been out to them, we've found that the ones that we've dealt with have been installation issues rather than the faulty product.
You indicate that in the ones that you've looked at, it's been an installation issue. I want to know how do you determine that it's an installation issue?
I wouldn't know. That's down to the engineers.
Right, exactly. Because we're talking about a tap. We're talking about a tap that has maybe been installed. It's been in place for perhaps a year and it fails.
Yeah.
So, if those grub screws have come loose, well, how do you determine that that's an installation issue? How do you determine that it's not simply with repetitive use, normal use, that those grub screws have worked loose? You're saying it's an installation issue. I question whether that's the case.
I believe in some cases we found out that the grub screws haven't been tightened up enough. We found that.
How would you know that? How would you know that? How would you know that?
I don't know. I don't know because I don't go out to them.
Right. Listen, I'm not trying to give you personally a hard time. You're just on the customer services line. I need this issue to be escalated to someone extremely senior within Bristan. As you could hear from that, I was pretty worked up. She did manage to calm me down by reassuring me on one particular question. I have fitted 20 of your taps. Now,
yeah.
When these fail, water comes gushing out, mains water comes gushing out all over their kitchen. Now, so far I've been fortunate. In those 3 cases, all of them failed when the customer was turning the tap on or off. They were present and they were there to deal with the emergency. My concern is what happens if they go out and the top shoots off because the grub screws have come loose and they come back, you know, 12 hours later and there's a major flood in their property. Are you going to take responsibility for the damage caused?
Yes, we do.
Absolutely.
Yes, we do.
When Bristan sent out their engineers to investigate problems, it is likely that they found some cases of installer error, whereby the base had been installed back to front. Their design engineers have addressed that issue in the design of the 2016 base. It's also likely that when they found taps with loose grub screws, they assumed that the installer had not tightened them properly in the first place. I assume that the Bristan engineers who go out and replace faulty taps are really plumbers like me. They're not real engineers like those in Bristan's design department or like Bertie here, who has an engineering degree. Consequently, it's understandable if Bristan's plumbers misinterpreted why the grub screws were loose, because they didn't understand the underlying design flaw that was causing them to loosen over time, even if tightened properly by the original installer. Assuming Bristan's plumbers reported back accurately to their design engineers, it is surprising to me that the design engineers still didn't spot the flaw in their design and recognise that correctly tightened grub screws were in fact working themselves loose gradually over a period of time. If they did spot the flaw, it seems incredible to me that they would not have admitted it to Bristan's senior management and recommended both a redesign and a product recall. If the problems had been thoroughly investigated and analysed back in January 2015, when plumbers like Ed were first reporting them to Bristan, they might have been able to come up with a redesign and issue a product recall 18 months ago. It would have been costly and embarrassing back then, but nothing like the nightmare that Bristan are faced with now in October 2016. They face the prospect of having to recall more than 2 years' worth of their popular kitchen tap range, and they appear to have not yet come up with a redesign that fixes the flaw. That is a nightmare that has been created by failings in Bristan's quality control. I hope that Bristan's design engineers will now find some of Bertie's design suggestions helpful. I also hope that Bristan will recognise that the nightmare they now face is one that they themselves have created. Their nightmare is not a certain plumber named Hamish, who happens to have exposed the problem. Hamish is just Bertie's nightmare. I'll explain that in a moment. Before we finish, I'd like to make a few suggestions of my own, and then to explain briefly why me and Bertie have made these videos. One simple suggestion when Bristan redesigned these taps: if you look at the reviews on Amazon for these, people don't like it that when you turn the tap off, the water that's retained in this section of the spout dribbles sporadically for several minutes afterwards. All you need to do to fix that is to change the aerator. This one has got quite large holes in it. If you put one in with a finer mesh, then you fix that problem immediately. Also, about the name Easyfit. When Bristan abandoned the grub screw method of securing the tap to the base, I think they should also abandon the name Easyfit along with it. For a start, it miscommunicates, because these taps are not really easier to fit, they're easier to fix. Call them something like the Turbo Fix or the Speed Fix range. And with the Speed Fix idea in mind, I suggest that you make sure that all these twin lever models use the same pair of ceramic disc cartridges, and likewise that all the single lever Speed Fix models use the same combined ceramic cartridge. That way, when whether your tap is simply dripping and needs new cartridges, or whether the tap is worn out and needs replacing, these taps will truly be the Speed Fix range. Finally, let me explain our motivation in making these videos. I made the first video primarily out of a concern for my own customers, but also with some concern for my own reputation and for potential liability that I could face if these taps flooded more of my customers' homes. In part 2, my concern was firstly for the tens of thousands of people around the country whose homes are currently at risk of flooding from these taps. Secondly, for all the plumbers like me who have fitted these and the damage that these taps could do to their reputation and their businesses. Sometimes in life, knowledge comes with responsibility. If you know something bad might happen to someone or to their property, but you fail to speak out and warn them, that is morally irresponsible. Sometimes you need the courage to poke your head above the parapet and follow your convictions, even if you risk being shot at in the process. So in part 2, we try to explain why the Easyfit design is flawed, and why these taps pose a serious flood risk to people's properties. Having pointed out what is wrong with Bristan's design, we also felt a sense of responsibility to suggest how Bristan might fix it. Contrary to what Bristan might suppose, our desire is not to damage Bristan's reputation, but to help them take appropriate action to get themselves out of the hole that they have dug for themselves. It is my hope that Bristan is big enough and has sufficient reserves to get through a painful and costly recall. I hope they will soon be able to put this fiasco behind them and continue into the years ahead with a bright future. Easyfit taps were my kitchen taps of choice, and I used to carry several models as van stock so that customers could choose one they liked. The taps look nice and feel nice. There's an elegance about them, and I always thought they were excellent value for money. I look forward to installing more of these in the future when Bristan have perfected the design and re-released them as something like the Speed Fix range. Perhaps you're watching this video after your home has been flooded, and you searched online to see if anyone else had reported problems with Easyfit taps. Please take a moment to share this video within your network of friends. There must be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of homeowners around the UK whose homes are at risk of flooding from a Bristan Easyfit kitchen tap. And if you don't warn them, they might not know until it's too late and they're calling their insurers. Some of them will have registered their taps with Bristan for the 5-year guarantee. Others won't have. So even when Bristan do a proper recall, they won't know where all these taps are. And if you'd like to know when I release any more videos, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Now, speaking of nightmares, I must confess that I am a bit irritated by Bertie, that he has called me an idiot more than once in this video. So I think it's time I told the story of how I became Bertie's nightmare on a certain day in early 2015. When we were kids, Bertie was always the smarter and also the more handsome of the two of us. And he used to do a lot of modelling. He always had something on the go. Near the end of 2014, I said to Bertie one day, "Bertie, I've been doing a spot of modelling." "What? At your age?" he replied. I said no more. A couple of months later, in early 2015, Bertie had to go up to London for a day on business. I dropped him at Exeter St David's and he caught the train to Waterloo. However, he decides to break his journey in Salisbury and have a quick coffee with a friend of his. He then grabbed a telegraph from the newsagents and headed back to Salisbury station. Suddenly, a sight caught his eye that made him gasp. "It can't be. I'm imagining it," he told himself. "There must have been something in the coffee." He reboarded the train and, in his methodical sort of way, read through the telegraph. The train was nearly into Waterloo when he opened the telegraph at the centre page, and again he let out a gasp. "Are you all right?" said the man opposite. At Waterloo he made his way down to the tube. Again he let out a gasp. "Funny," remarked the man next to him. "He looks rather like you." At this point Bertie began pinching himself. "I'll wake up soon," he told himself. "I must be having a nightmare." As he walked into the office, the nightmare continued. Quite shaken, Bertie settled down to a day's work, but found it hard to concentrate all day. On the way home, he thought he'd avoid the tube and caught a taxi instead. The driver kept looking at him in his mirror. "You look familiar," the driver remarked. "Have I seen you somewhere before?" "I don't think so," said Bertie. "Oh well," said the driver. "Do you mind if I listen to the radio?" "Go ahead," said Bertie. As they made their way to Waterloo, let me show you some of the sights Bertie saw and what he heard on the radio.
Self-employed plumber Hamish Erskine decided to move his business online. Hamish, what made you go digital?
I think I'd be hugely missing out on customers if I wasn't online. That's where most people go these days.
Graham, you're one of Hamish's customers. What's your view?
If I need anything at all, I always look online. If Hamish had not been online, then I wouldn't have found him.
People are looking for businesses like yours online. If your business isn't there, they can't find you. Do more with your business online. Visit greatbusiness.gov.uk/do more online.
At this point, Bertie could take no more and asked the driver to pull over. He jumped onto a bus instead. Even then, the nightmare didn't stop. He got off near Waterloo and walked the rest of the way. Getting on the train, as Bertie chose a seat, he checked the papers that other passengers were reading. Not seeing a telegraph, he felt relieved and sat down. Some way into the journey, the man opposite kept looking up from his Independent and staring at Bertie. A lady diagonally opposite was reading the Week magazine, and she also started staring. Then the man with the Independent opened his paper and asked, "Is that you?" The lady opened her Week magazine and said, "You're in here too." As if things couldn't get any worse, another passenger opened his Daily Mail and was about to say something. Bertie let out a howl and fled down the aisle. He slumped to the floor next to the toilets and began sobbing deliriously, and then muttering to himself about how he'd paid for his ticket but had nowhere to sit except on the floor. Wasn't it time the railways were returned to the public realm? Fortunately, no one was videoing Bertie's rant. Otherwise, South West Trains might have uploaded the CCTV showing him running madly past lots of empty seats, and Bertie would have looked like a right plonker. When he got home that night, I saw him coming to the door and opened it for him. There I was in my blue overalls. Bertie shrieked and uttered 3 small words, "Give me scotch," and retreated to his room. He emerged a week later, a changed and humbled man. Well, for a day or two anyway. Now, just occasionally, he needs to be reminded. I shouldn't be too hard on Bertie, though. After all, it was only because of the amazing job that Bertie had done marketing my plumbing business that I got headhunted by the government for the Do More Online campaign. They liked the website Bertie had made and the way he had got me to #1 on Google. I've also really appreciated Bertie's help in the making of these videos. Until we teamed up in part 2, it had never occurred to me that Bertie and I might make a good video team. I don't imagine us making more videos about Bristan taps, apart from perhaps a small update. But I can imagine us making more videos about lots of other things. Between the two of us, Bertie and I are quite opinionated about lots of things, including plumbing, websites, marketing, even politics and religion. So why not subscribe to my YouTube channel and you'll be the first to know when we release something new. Hamish, I do owe you an apology for calling you an idiot. It's hard sometimes when you have a name that most people use for their West Highland Terrier. But I do admit you are actually smarter than you look. Thanks, Bertie. It's not often that you apologise. I do also think that one other apology is in order. I received an email on Tuesday 27th of September 2016 from someone who had just fitted an Easyfit tap and then, to his horror, come across my first 2 videos. He describes a conversation he had with Bristan earlier that afternoon as follows. Bristan said they had seen your videos and your argument are just your personal view, just one plumber. They also said they had investigated the failure and, as far as they know, all the failures were incorrectly fitted in the first place. Something about one of the parts being the wrong way round, did not understand the point. Bristan are still blaming this problem on the plumbers of Great Britain, even after their design flaw has been explained to them. They're still trying to attribute this problem to the base being installed back to front, or possibly to the grub screws not being done up tight enough. I can personally guarantee that on the 21 taps I installed, of which 4 have so far failed, the base was installed correctly and the grub screws were done up tight initially. If this email accurately describes Bristan's current response, it suggests 2 things to me. Firstly, they appear not to have understood the explanation, in which case the head of their design team has some serious questions to answer. Secondly, if this accurately reflects the level of their investigations, the head of their quality control team has more serious questions to answer. And if they think this is simply the view of one plumber, what about plumber Croft, who a whole year ago, on the 1st of October 2015, correctly identified why the grub screws work loose as they work their way up the bevel on the base? When Croft was seeking compensation from Bristan for damage to his customer's property and to his plumbing firm's reputation, I really don't think it was for damage caused by his own installer error. Perhaps it's time for Bristan to admit their mistake and to come clean about the flaw in their design. Bristan introduced their Easyfit kitchen taps in 2014. According to my own personal experience of them, they start popping after about 8 months. According to other plumbers on the UK Plumbers Forum, they sometimes pop sooner than that. I wonder how the occurrence rate of these taps popping will grow over the coming months. Will it be a linear growth rate or will it be exponential over time? If Bristan are lucky, it will be linear. But if it is exponential, Bristan haven't a moment to lose. Because Plumber Croft won't be the last person seeking compensation from Bristan for a flooded kitchen. I think it's time Bristan apologised to the plumbers of Great Britain. Even last Tuesday they were blaming them for this problem. Over the coming months, Bristan are going to need the plumbers of Great Britain to get themselves out of the hole they have dug themselves into. Well, we're pretty much done. Bertie, do you have any final comment you'd like to make? Not really, but I wonder if you think there's any kind of moral to this whole story. Actually, yes. I think you should never underestimate what a plumber can do. Well, that's all we've got time for this evening, so it's good night from me, and it's good night from him. Good night. Good night.